Welcome back, everybody. This is public speaking for Tuesday, the 18th of August. And what I've indicated in our notes is how the semester will be playing out because, believe it or not, we are towards the end. So, this upcoming Thursday, the 20th, is when you will have your third quiz. It'll be very similar to the first two quizzes that you've taken. And I'm also asking that you set up a practice session with me for quiz number 3, which is your persuasive speech, that you do so before August 25th, which is next Tuesday. So that is when you will be delivering your final speech. If you can also notify me if you are going to be uploading your speech or if you think you're going to be using Zoom. And if you are interested in using Zoom on the 25th, please indicate the days or the times of day that you are available. And I'll try to find a common time for us. So you can contact me via my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. As I indicated, on Tuesday of next week, the 25th, is when you will be delivering speech 3, and then the semester ends on the following Thursday, the 27th, which is when you've got quiz number 4. And in terms of the quizzes, I dropped the lowest quiz grade, so if it turns out that you didn't take a quiz, or if it turns out that you didn't do well on a quiz, you might want to use quiz number 4 to substitute for that. If you did very well on your first 3 quizzes, you can elect not to take quiz number 4 if you'd like. Basically, what I'm going to be doing for that Thursday class is having you respond to the speeches of your peers, the way you have been doing for attendance credit thus far. And in terms of what we're talking about today, now that we have completed the informative speech, and if you haven't sent me your notes for that particular speech, your speaking notes, please do so. And I'll be contacting you soon too if you haven't necessarily done that by now. Where we are is talking about speech number 3. And speech number 3 is a 15-minute speech in which you are going to be asked to persuade the audience to either take an action or to support a belief, or perhaps both. And I'm sort of torn as to which might be more challenging. Sometimes it's more challenging to ask an audience to take an action. For instance, think about a persuasive speech about, let's say, improving your diet, which is something that most people agree with, but yet taking the action to do it can be very difficult. And I've seen the opposite occur as well, where taking an action is fairly easy, such as signing a petition. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your belief system has changed. You might have all kinds of ulterior motives for signing that petition that have nothing to do with supporting that particular cause. So in terms of the persuasive speech, your goal is not necessarily to convince everyone in the audience to think exactly the way you do, but to earn your audience's respect. And that, I think, is the key to being able to disagree civilly. In terms of how you can go about choosing a topic, for those of you who like controversy, feel free to choose a controversial topic. For those of you who don't like controversy, you don't have to choose a controversial topic necessarily. Again, there are lots of topics that have pretty low controversy associated with them. Things like improving diet, increasing exercise, almost certainly something related to reducing costs for education will be something that most of your audience already agrees with, because you are working with a college level audience. Though if you were presenting to the public, it might be a very different sort of thing. And you can think about former assignments that you've done in other classes. I know that oftentimes in English classes, you might be asked to write a position paper, and you could perhaps adapt that if you so wanted. You can also review your speeches, speech number 1 and speech number 2, and see if there's some sort of issue that you could use for your controversial topic. Remember, the idea behind a persuasive speech is that this is something that reasonable people could disagree with, that there aren't outside facts to necessarily prove the position. That said, you might believe in that position and believe that that position is true. But what you have to keep in mind is that you will have members in your audience that will have different beliefs. And how do you address that? And usually you've got 3 groups in an audience. There's the group that already agrees with you. And if that's the case, let's hope that by the ending of your speech, they still agree with you. If not, you've done something wrong. There's a group that completely disagrees with you. Doesn't much matter what you say or do. It's not very likely they're going to change their minds. And then there's the swing group, for lack of a better expression, people on the fence who could be persuaded. And they may be persuaded in that moment, or you may just necessarily be planting a small seed that will take months, even years, to grow. So your job, outside of choosing your topic, is to think a little bit about what the opposite position is and to try to refute that. Now, this can be tricky when you've got only 15 minutes. You don't want to lose control of your particular speech and your position. But rather than ignoring the elephant in the room, so to speak, it's better to address that there could be opposite positions and briefly indicate why those positions don't have as much strength as the position that you happen to be supporting. Outside sources enhance credibility, and that's one of the reasons why for this particular speech you are going to be asked to use 3 outside sources. I stopped counting after 3. Use as many as you like. If you remember in a previous class, we had talked a little bit about research and using the libraries, and what you want to do is to find a source that has some validity to it. And in terms of indicating how or where that source is being used, you can keep it very simple in the context of delivering your speech. Just very briefly mentioning something like according to this author would be perfectly fine. And then the idea is that you would have further detail for anyone in your audience who might ask for that. So what I'm asking for you to do is on your speaking outline, at the ending of it, if you could just list your sources. You don't have to follow any particular formatting guideline. This would be, again, in your notes to share with your audience in the event that someone asked you for some further information about where you were able to get that particular fact. So I'll take a quick peek at it, and again, in the real world, no one would look at it, but you still want to make sure that you're being ethical. We had talked about ethos at the beginning of the semester. So, in terms of trying to motivate individuals, and this could be a class in and of itself, but there are basically 3 major ways to motivate individuals to either support a position or to take an action. The first is known as affiliation, the idea of belonging. People want to belong. It's one of the things that advertisers use very well, the idea that they have a very popular product and that you too want to purchase it because others have purchased it, and you want to be part of the group. Achievement or success, and advertisers use this very well, where they oftentimes link usually expensive products with achievement and success. Let's say high-end cars, for instance. So the person who's driving that high-end car is usually dressed as if they're successful, and more often than not, the car is associated with a home that would seem to suggest success and power and money. But power is a very different motivator as well, the idea of control. All 3 of these can work together, but they can also work separately as well. And using car commercials again as an example, the idea that you have the power over that enclosed environment and that you can manipulate it in the way that you want. So the 4th way, and I know I said there were 3 motivational appeals, I kind of fibbed. There is one more that's incredibly effective but also incredibly dangerous, and that's fear. Fear works as a superb motivator. We have seen that in our media and in our political world, especially over the last several years. The problem with fear is that it interferes with reasoning. So you want to use it cautiously, and you want to try to determine why you are trying to use fear. I've seen it done effectively. Things like to quit smoking, and then oftentimes what you see is a very disturbing picture of some medical issues one might experience if they continue smoking. So I guess you could argue that the ends justify the means in that particular instance. But again, fear can interfere with reasoning, so you need to be very careful with that. And our textbook talks about Monroe's motivated sequence. It's a sequence that works to help motivate an audience to support a position. But the reality is that we've basically been talking about this in one way or another all semester long, even though Monroe actually wrote it down and got credit for it. Basically, you need to get your audience's attention, and then you need to illustrate that there's some sort of need, something that needs to be changed, and that your proposal will allow for some level of satisfaction. And then you can visualize with your audience so that they can see the positives that will result. And then if it turns out that you wanted your audience to do anything in particular or take some kind of action, that would be the time to do it. Now, in terms of arguments and reasoning, and that too is a class in and of itself, but I just wanted very briefly to review that an argument is basically a claim, a position that you're taking that reasonable people could disagree about. And you are providing evidence, so you are using hopefully some facts, and you have some sort of a reasoning pattern. So what you are arguing makes a certain level of sense. Now, even a claim of fact, the idea of a fact is something that can't be debated, but a claim of fact could be debated. Think about something like GCC is a small school. And while that is true, the difficulty with that statement, the difficulty with that fact is in comparison to what? And in comparison to what might mean that GCC is actually a very large school. So when you're making a claim of fact, you're claiming that something is or is not. But again, it can be debated. A claim of value is when you're debating whether something is good or bad. Something like GCC is a good school. And again, the question is measurement. How do you measure something like good? Or claim of policy. And this is a specific course of action. For instance, GCC should reestablish a sports program. Whether you realize this or not, we used to have a sports program, but because of economic challenges, we no longer have that sports program. And it's been quite a while since we've had it. And again, it can be debated that it might have been to our economic benefit to not have that program, but it might have also been to our economic harm that we didn't have that program. So again, something that can be debated. And the reasoning in which you use, and I suspect you'll use all different kinds of examples of reasoning, but if you think about inductive reasoning, usually what you're using are specific examples, for instance, medical studies, in order to draw a particular conclusion. If you're using deductive reasoning, that's the generalization, that's the conclusion that you draw. And then if you're reasoning from sign, there's some sort of observable mark that allows you to make some sort of a judgment. So for instance, inductive reasoning might be using medical studies in terms of, let's say, trying to find an effective vaccine for COVID-19. If there are enough medical examples to illustrate that the vaccine is effective, we can deduce, we can generalize that this is a safe vaccine. And that said, there have oftentimes been errors that have been made in terms of that. You think about a generalization that college leads to success, and that is true, but that's not necessarily true for every individual who goes to college. And reasoning from sign, an observable mark. So again, to use an example from the virus, a fever is supposed to be one of the signs or one of the marks of that particular illness, though it can also be a sign or a mark of other illnesses as well. The problem with reasoning is that we oftentimes engage in errors in reasoning. This is very human. We do it all the time when we interact with others. But when we are putting together an argument formally, for instance, a speech, we want to try to avoid as many errors as possible. And certainly when we are consuming speeches, the consumer imperative, we want to be able to point out where there are errors in reasoning. And that too is a class in and of itself, but just to give you an idea of some very common errors in reasoning. The hasty generalization, that there's too little evidence in order to be able to support a particular position. Let's say something like you've drawn a conclusion that this is going to be a very hot summer because we've had several hot days. Are you making a hasty generalization? Are just a few hot days enough to draw that particular conclusion? You can do the appeal to ignorance, which is a particularly interesting error in reasoning, where basically you're pointing out what the audience doesn't know. So now the burden of proof is on the audience rather than on you. So again, the idea is, well, if this vaccine doesn't work, prove to me that it doesn't work, as opposed to saying it's my responsibility to prove to you that it works. The bandwagon fallacy. And this is very common, again, with advertisers. We want to be part of the crowd just because everybody else is doing it. We want to be involved in it as well. The sequential fallacy, that what comes first must influence what comes next. I've seen this done many times politically, that if things are going well with the economy, the politician in place will take credit. If things are going poorly for the economy, the politician in place will say that they are not responsible and there are other factors to play. So it isn't very easy necessarily to separate cause and effect. Begging the question, which is circular reasoning, it's just rephrasing the question. So if you wanted to ask something like, what is the faculty parking lot? It's the parking lot for faculty. I mean, basically, you might perhaps recognize a question like, what is empathic listening? It is listening with empathy. You haven't necessarily answered the question there. You've just rephrased the question. The question, which had appeared on a quiz, was trying to get you to define what empathy is, which is being emotionally supportive. The appeal to authority, in other words, a celebrity endorsement. The person that is presented as being an authority doesn't necessarily have that much authority. They might have popularity, they might have fame, but they don't necessarily have expertise in that particular area. But that said, of course, because of the bandwagon fallacy, we want to join the crowd. If that particular, let's say, celebrity has lots of fans, we might want to be part of that group that also is supportive of their particular endorsement. And name calling. And I guess this one is pretty obvious. It's an attack on the individual rather than on the argument. It's what I call the schoolyard kind of philosophy, where you're calling people names. And I think on an intellectual level, we all know that we're not supposed to be doing any of these errors in reasoning. But on an emotional level, we know that oftentimes our judgment can be clouded. And I can't remember if I've mentioned a language theorist by the name of Frank Luntz before, but he's known for trying to come up with terms, specific language that individuals can be motivated by to support or not support a particular policy. He's hired both by politicians and also business leaders to try to come up with 2 or 3 really telling words that'll motivate individuals. He is responsible for the term war on terror, advising his clients that a war on any particular person, group, or nation would not receive as much universal support as a war on terror. He also is responsible for the death tax, if you've ever heard about that. It used to be called the estate tax, but estate sounds wealthy. And there was no controversy about the estate tax, that when someone died, if they had a certain number of assets, well, then those assets would be taxed. But on his advice, politicians changed the term from estate tax to death tax. And now something that wasn't very controversial became very controversial because people were quite irate that they were being taxed to death. Same tax, just different language in terms to try to motivate individuals. That's much more subtle than, let's say, name calling. And today I wanted to leave you with a video because sometimes it's better to use the you can't make this stuff up life experiences than anything you might find in a textbook. And basically, this was a story about 2 college debate teams. If you know anything about college debate, basically you've got a group of individuals who are trying to support a particular position, and then the other team is taking the opposite side. And then usually there are a panel of judges made up of professors from both schools and sometimes outside schools as well to make a decision as to which team put forth the strongest argument. And as you will see in the attachment that I have with both a news article and also a snippet of that video, things didn't go well. And if you're assuming that things didn't go well with the debate team, you're wrong. What didn't go well was the altercation between the debate coaches, the 2 professors from the 2 different teams. There's a lot of subtext here. These are professors who didn't like one another, who competed against one another previously, talking about, in this particular debate, a very heated topic about race relations. One of the professors is a Caucasian male. The other professor is an African American female. So there's lots of subtext going on here. But basically, the end result is that one of the students filmed the incident, which went on YouTube, and then it basically went viral. And the result of that was that one of the professors, the Caucasian male, was fired, and the other professor, the African American female, was put on probation. And you can debate with yourself and with others as to whether or not you think that was a just punishment. But basically, in the snippet that I was able to find for you, and I hope you can still access it. The professors have tried very hard to remove all traces of this on the internet, but there always is an electronic footprint. So thus far, I've always been able to find at least some version of that video. And let that be a caution to you to be very careful. Once you post something on the internet, it basically is there for life, even if you try to remove it. So exercise judgment. But you can see that what they did was begin yelling at one another and then cursing at one another. And then at one point, it looked like the altercation might even become physical, and they had to be separated by students and other faculty. And the Caucasian male professor lowered his pants and mooned the other professor. And there's some debate about whether this was even a legitimate mooning because underwear was still worn. So, why am I sharing this with you? And I'm sharing this with you to illustrate how easy it is to make errors in reasoning, how easy it is to let emotion take over reason and rationality. That two people who are trained in communications, highly respected and esteemed, could descend to that level. If nothing else, use this as a cautionary tale about what you don't want to do when you are delivering your speech. So that said, I will leave you with that article and also with that snippet of video. Today's attendance question is for you to watch the informative speeches of your peers if you haven't already done so, and to indicate a strength and weakness for each of those speeches. Please send that to me via email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And what I will do is compile all of that the way I did with the first speech and post it. So I hope you're all well. I am well. I'm looking forward to hear what you're thinking about with your persuasive speech now that our semester is coming to an end. And I will talk with you soon. Bye.